They say every queen deserves peace. But Catherine of Aragon was never granted the courtesy of a quiet death. Not in life. Not in memory. Not even in the grave. For more than 300 years, her body lay undisturbed beneath the stones of Peterborough Cathedral, wrapped in the silence of history and the dust of those who tried to forget her. But even then, she could not be left alone. In the year 1777, a man took a steel drill to her coffin not to honor her, not to investigate with reverence, but out of simple, vulgar curiosity. He bore into the lead, casing like one might puncture a tin of dried meat. And what he unleashed was not merely air or dust, but a rupture in dignity that would never again be sealed. Long before she became a corpse, someone dared to puncture. Catherine was a crown jewel, not merely the daughter of the Spanish Catholic monarchs, but a symbol of the greatest alliance between England and Spain that the Tudor dynasty ever hoped to achieve. When she arrived in England as a teenage bride promised to Prince Arthur, her fate had already been carved in stone, not by her own hands, but by the ambitions of kings and the machinations of dynasties. She was not born to be a woman, she was born to be a queen. And when Arthur died before their marriage could take root, she was placed in political limbo. A foreign princess without a throne, a widow without a future, until Henry, her dead husband's younger brother, came of age, and came to see her not as a relic of a failed alliance, but as the fulfillment of one. They married in the year 1509. It was glorious, hopeful, radiant with potential, and for nearly 2 decades, she was Queen of England, beloved by the people, respected across Europe, and, for a time, deeply cherished by her husband. But as the years wore on, and no living son arrived, her power withered in the shadow of Henry's desperation. Her womb, once a symbol of promise, became a chamber of disappointment, miscarriages, stillbirths. The brief life and swift death of the infant, Prince Henry, each loss chipped away at her safety, until the woman who had once commanded courtly admiration found herself banished. First emotionally, then physically, to the crumbling edges of a court that no longer welcomed her. Anne Boleyn came like a storm, and Catherine, once a wife, became an obstacle. She was stripped of her title, banished to Kimbleton Castle, her household reduced, her visitors restricted, but she never surrendered her crown. Until her last breath, she signed her name as Katherine the Queen, a title Henry insisted she no longer had the right to bear. And when she died in the cold of January, in the year 1536, she died with that quiet defiance, not screaming, not begging, simply holding on to the truth of who she was. But England did not honor her as a queen. No Westminster Abbey funeral, no royal procession, no grand tomb. Her body was embalmed hastily, organ removed, and placed in a lead coffin for transport to Peterborough Abbey, a lovely church, but one that reeked of compromise. She was buried without a crown, without her daughter by her side, and with only a few loyal servants to whisper prayers over her as the stone slab was sealed above her head. Her tomb bore no inscription of queenship, only the cold label Dowager Princess of Wales, a final insult. And then, time passed, decades folded into centuries. The Reformation faded, then reignited. Monarchs were born and buried. Civil war came and went. And through it all, Catherine slept beneath the cathedral floor, her body slowly transforming, as all bodies do, into history's dust, until 1777. The man's name was not important. He was no scientist. No, royal. No guardian of her memory. Just a local official with a tool and an unhealthy appetite for discovery, with no authorization, no ceremony, no permission from the church or the crown. He pierced the lead shell of Catherine's coffin. At first, he found only darkness and the rich, earthy scent of centuries. Then, as he widened the hole, he saw it, the fabric that had once wrapped her body, the last layer of dignity separating a queen from decay. He removed a piece, just a corner, a small shred. But that theft broke the seal. Air poured in, and what had been preserved for over 2 centuries, embalmed, wrapped, honored in its own fragile way, began to collapse. The fabrics unraveled. The skin, once sealed against time, began to dry and flake. The face that once stared down courtiers and kissed her daughter on the forehead now lay vulnerable, unguarded, exposed to the damp curiosity of the living. And still, no one stopped him. No plaque was erected to condemn the act. No public mourning. No apology. Not even an official record of the violation for decades to come. Catherine, even in death, remained forgotten. A royal wife rendered irrelevant by newer queens. More dramatic deaths. Bloodier scandals. Anne's ghost would haunt the tower. Elizabeth's myth would echo in gold and poetry. But Catherine the First, the longest serving, the most discarded, lay drilled open and decaying underfoot. And yet, she refused to disappear. In the centuries that followed, visitors continued to pass through Peterborough. Some noticed her stone. Some did not. For years, it remained nearly bare. Then, slowly, flowers began to appear. People began calling her Queen Catherine again. A small plaque was added. A rail was installed. Her memory, once corroded, like the lead that held her, began to shine again, not because history changed, but because people refused to forget. The drill hole remains. It is small, easy to miss, but it is there. A wound, a violation, a reminder that even in death, queens are not safe. That even after centuries, history still has claws. That even the most forgotten woman can rise again, not in body, but in memory. And that sometimes, the true desecration does not come from fire or axe, but from a quiet hole, made by a man who thought no one would care. He was wrong. Before she was buried in darkness, before her name was stripped from marble, before England forgot her until it was convenient to remember, Catherine of Aragon had once walked into this kingdom, draped in gold and prophecy. The daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, raised in palaces where incense floated through the corridors and tutors whispered Latin into her ears before she could write her name in her native tongue. She had come not as a guest, but as an answer. A solution to an alliance carved from Catholic glory. Arriving on English shores as a teenager, meant to seal a bond between 2 worlds with her body, her faith, and her silence. They married her to Arthur I, the Tudor prince, born from the ambition of Henry VII and the hope of a newly built dynasty that had clawed its way to power through blood and banners rather than birthright. Arthur, frail and elegant, was a boy of books and obligations, younger than his crown and older than his years. And their marriage was one of calculation, a union inked in treaties long before either child could choose. The ceremony was magnificent, the streets of London draped in celebration. Foreign fabrics pulled across cathedral pews, and behind the lace and ritual stood a girl with fire in her eyes and iron in her spine. But Arthur was not made for longevity. Less than 5 months into their union, he died in Ludlow Castle, his lungs likely claimed by the cold dampness of the Welsh winter, or by some unseen plague, or perhaps simply by the truth that he had never been strong enough to carry the weight placed on him from birth. And Catherine, barely 15, now a widow, now a diplomatic inconvenience, was left in limbo. She claimed the marriage had never been consummated. The court needed to believe her, for if she had lain with Arthur as wife in body as well as in name, then the laws of the church would forbid her from marrying his brother, and the alliance between England and Spain would crumble like parchment in the rain. So she waited. Years passed, slow and silent. Her Spanish attendant dwindled. Her dowry remained unpaid. Henry VII began to lose interest in the foreign princess, now lodged uneasily in his court. Her letters grew more desperate. She pawned her jewelry to feed her household. Her gowns grew thin. Her pride did not. And then Henry died, and the crown passed to his son, the boy she had once seen as a brother-in-law. Now a king. Now a man of 17 with a face made for portraits and a hunger for legacy. They married in June of 1509, and the court erupted with joy. Henry VIII was tall, charismatic, golden-haired, and athletic, and Catherine was serene, graceful, well-educated, and already trained to play queen. For a time, it seemed the union would blossom into legend. The people adored her. Foreign courts respected her. And Henry, so newly crowned, so convinced of divine favor, loved her. Or at least loved the image. She helped him project a strong, stable, Catholic monarch presiding over a court glittering with elegance and purpose. And she loved him. Not because he was perfect, not because he was kind, but because she had been raised to believe in duty, and love grew where duty led. She bore him children, many. Most did not survive. Stillbirths, miscarriages, an infant son who lived for less than 2 months. And then, finally, Mary, a girl, the wrong sex in the eyes of Henry, but a life nonetheless. A child, a daughter Catherine cherished with the full intensity of a mother who had buried too many swaddled hopes to take even a moment for granted. But Henry changed, not all at once, but steadily, like a tide that retreats slowly, pulling away bit by bit until the sand beneath your feet is cold and dry and you realize you've been left behind. The man who had once written love letters in verse began to drift toward other women, other possibilities, other dreams of sons. His eyes landed on Anne Boleyn, sharp-tongued, calculating, unwilling to be another mistress, discarded like a broken goblet. Anne wanted a crown, and Henry, now nearing 40, still without a male heir, still convinced of his divine mandate, began to see Catherine not as his wife, but as a roadblock. The marriage had to be undone. He claimed it was cursed, invalid, an affront to heaven, because she had once been his brother's widow. Catherine denied it. Again and again, she swore before God and all who would listen that she had entered marriage with Henry pure, that her marriage to Arthur had been in name only, but truth no longer mattered. Henry wanted what he wanted, and what he wanted was Anne, and a son by Anne, and the freedom to rewrite the laws of marriage and church, if it meant securing the future of his bloodline. Catherine refused. She refused to agree to an annulment. She refused to call herself anything but queen. She refused to leave court. She refused to call Anne her majesty. She refused to vanish quietly. and so they stripped her of everything else. They took her title. They removed her from court. They sent her to increasingly remote castles with dwindling servants and fewer comforts. She was forbidden to see her daughter. Her letters were intercepted. Her health deteriorated. But her resolve never did. In letters written in Latin, in Spanish, in English, she signed the same name, Katherine the Queen. Her handwriting, even as her fingers grew stiff from the cold stone floors of Kimbleton, never wavered. And though she was alone, though the court celebrated Anne's swelling belly and crowned her in Catherine's place, the people remembered. In villages, they still prayed for Queen Catherine. In corners of the kingdom, they whispered that Anne was no rightful queen, and that Henry, once beloved, had begun to look like a king who had bartered his soul for a womb. Catherine died in January of 1536. She was 50. Her heart had failed, or so the physicians said, though some claimed poison. Others whispered of grief, and a few believed it was simply the final toll of a life lived under a crown that cut deeper than any knife. Her body was embalmed quickly, her heart and intestines buried separately, and her funeral was orchestrated not as a royal burial, but as the departure of a dowager princess, the title forced upon her by the man who had once sworn before God to love her above all others. She had married 2 princes, but she had loved only one, and that one Henry, her second husband, the father of her only living child. The man she had stood beside for over 20 years did not come to her funeral. He did not send Mary. He did not weep. He did not even pause, because by then, he had already buried the version of Catherine he had once adored, replacing her with a myth more convenient, more politically useful, more sterile, and Catherine, who had given him her youth, her dignity, her loyalty, her body, and the best years of her life, was buried not in state, not with trumpets and Latin requiems echoing through Westminster, but quietly, in Peterborough, beneath a stone that would one day lie and say she was never queen at all. But you cannot erase love, not real love, not the kind Catherine carried even as it poisoned her, not the kind that wrote itself into the eyes of her daughter, not the kind that lived even when history tried to dig it out and drill it open and let the air rot it away. She loved Henry, and that was the tragedy. Not that she lost him, but that she never stopped wanting him back. Even as he walked away, even as he called another woman wife, even as he made England forget her, it was not exile in the way most queens would understand it. There was no public humiliation, no trial, no gallows, no violent mob calling for her blood. There was only distance, the slow, grinding removal of presence, the absence of ceremony, the retreat of warm fires and the echo of laughter in courtly halls replaced by stone walls that did not speak, and servants who dared not make eye contact. Catherine of Aragon was not dragged from her throne. She was erased from it, one day at a time, until the space she had once filled with dignity and devotion grew cold. As if her very memory had been shut behind a heavy door no one wanted to open again. After more than 2 decades as Queen of England, she was reduced to a title she had not chosen, Dowager Princess of Wales, and exiled to a series of remote houses, each one colder than the last. Further and further from the throne, from her daughter, from the life she had once believed would be hers, until the end. And finally, they brought her to Kimbleton Castle, a structure of grey stone and creeping damp, surrounded not by court musicians or visiting dignitaries, but by wind, silence, and the occasional sound of a distant bell tolling in the countryside for a queen who still lived but had been declared absent. In that room, tucked into the far reaches of a fortress not built to comfort but to contain. Catherine waited, her world narrowed to a single chamber with a draught beneath the door, and memories that refused to leave. The tapestries were worn. The light was thin. The fire smoked when it tried to warm her. But she clung to her routine with the discipline of a woman who had lost everything except faith. She dressed each morning in black, as if in mourning for a life she had not yet surrendered. She prayed in Latin, whispered psalms through dry lips. She wrote letters dozens, hundreds to her daughter, to her nephews in Spain, to the Pope, to the king, who no longer answered her name. And she waited. She waited for Henry to come to his senses, for the advisors to change, for Anne to fall from favor, for the will of God to restore what ambition had taken. She waited not with naivety, but with the hardened patience of a woman who had known loss before and believed in justice not because it was promised, but because it had to exist somewhere, even if only beyond this life. She was, after all, still a queen in her soul, even if no one outside that room believed it anymore. The furnishings in Kimbleton were not regal. The bed creaked. The cushions were thin. The walls wept moisture in the winter and radiated nothing in the summer. But she refused to complain. When her household was cut down to a handful of servants, she made no protest. When they denied her access to her daughter, she wept alone, silently, and only at night, when news arrived that Anne Boleyn was pregnant, and that the court was preparing for the birth of a male heir. She said nothing to her ladies, but her hands trembled, and the letter she had been writing remained unfinished for 2 full days. That was the kind of queen she was, not one who ruled through spectacle, but through endurance. She received no visits from the king. He had ceased addressing her in letters. When he sent word, it came through ambassadors or cold formalities, always referring to her as Princess Dowager, never as Queen, as if repeating the lie often enough would make it true. But Catherine signed every letter with the same title, Katherine the Queen. No more, no less. Her name inked in the same hand she had used to sign treaties, to bless royal decrees, to instruct her daughter in the ways of duty and faith. She had been trained for this role her entire life. She would not surrender it for convenience. And yet, the world beyond Kimbleton did not stop. London moved on. The court glittered with Anne's rise. Her belly swelled. Her titles multiplied. And Henry smiled in public again, though behind closed doors. The rumors said he was restless, anxious, prone to bursts of rage when the child did not arrive quickly enough, or when his conscience whispered too loudly in the quiet of night. But Catherine heard none of this. She was kept away from news unless it was sent to wound. The silence, in its own way, became a message, one that said, "You are no longer part of this story." But Catherine knew better, because stories do not end when the page is turned. They end when the truth is buried. And she would not be buried yet. She continued her rituals, Mass each day, a simple breakfast, long hours by the window, watching the changing sky. Her health began to falter. Her body, once strong enough to carry child after child, began to ache. Her joints stiffened. Her appetite waned. She coughed through the night. But when questioned, she denied weakness. When doctors arrived, she downplayed her pain. She was not afraid of death, but she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. And so the days blurred. The seasons passed through her room like visitors who never stayed long. Sometimes her daughter Mary would write, though her letters were censored, heavily redacted, or delayed until they were months old. Still, Catherine held them close. read them beneath the covers like a girl clinging to candlelight. Mary was all she had left, the only living proof that her reign had once mattered, that she had once stood beside a king, not beneath his judgment. Then, in the final months of the year 1535, something shifted. She grew weaker. The pain became sharper, more constant. Her chest felt heavy. The breath came slow. Her ladies whispered when they thought she could not hear. Physicians came more often. The bishop, who had once heard her private confessions, arrived unannounced. And Catherine, still composed, still resolute, began to prepare. Not for rescue, but for rest. She requested a black cross to be placed at the foot of her bed. She asked for Mass to be said more frequently. She wrote her final letters to her nephew Charles, to Mary, and even to Henry. That last letter, though preserved in fragments, was not one of bitterness. It was one of peace. She forgave him. She blessed him. She prayed for his soul. And then she signed, one last time, Katherine the Queen. And when the time came, in the bitter January chill of early 1536, she did not cry out. She simply lay back, folded her hands, and whispered a prayer. Her last breath left her quietly, like smoke from a dying candle. No crowd stood vigil. No procession followed. Only her maids, her priest, her dignity. The room where she had waited became the room where she died. Not with thunder, but with grace. They buried her as if she had never been a queen. No trumpets, no royal banners, no procession that stretched for miles through London's narrow streets, as it once would have for a sovereign who had ruled beside a king. There were no velvet cushions beneath her crown, for she was denied a crown at all. And no choir of noble voices to lift her name to heaven. Only a quiet, hurried funeral, carried out with a sense of discomfort rather than reverence, as though the entire kingdom wished to close the chapter on her life before her body had even cooled. Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, was buried as the Dowager Princess of Wales. The title given to her after her marriage was declared void, though she had never accepted it. Though she had died still believing herself Queen of England. Her coffin was made of lead, heavy and cold, lined with simple cloth rather than royal silk. Her heart and organs had been removed in the old Spanish fashion of embalming, placed in separate containers and sealed in wax. They dressed her not in gold, but in black. Not as a monarch, but as a widow. And when her body was laid into the coffin, the attendants noted the calmness of her expression, the faint trace of a smile that had not yet faded from her lips. She had died, believing her daughter would someday reclaim the dignity that had been taken from them both. But the England that watched her coffin travel north did not share that faith. The journey from Kimbleton to Peterborough was long and bitter. The roads made treacherous by January mud and frost. Her small procession, no more than a few carriages, a handful of servants, and the clergy who had not dared to abandon her moved slowly, almost invisibly, through villages that had once cheered her name. Some villagers still knelt as the convoy passed, bowing their heads in secret prayer for Queen Catherine. For they still called her that, even when the crown no longer did. Others watched silently, afraid to speak. For to honor her openly was now considered an act of defiance against the king. Inside the lead coffin, her body lay wrapped in the same humility that had defined her exile, modest, untouched by finery, encased not in gold, but in faith. It was faith that had carried her through humiliation, through years of isolation, through the betrayal of her husband and the separation from her child, and now, in death, It was faith that carried her to her final resting place. Peterborough Abbey was chosen for her burial not because it was grand enough for a queen, but because it was convenient. Henry's court did not wish to spend the resources or the honor of a state funeral on the woman he had divorced. Westminster Abbey was forbidden to her. Even the heralds struggled to describe her new status, uncertain whether she should be treated as a royal or a mere noblewoman. In the end, the compromise was as cruel as it was deliberate. She was to be buried with the ceremony due to a princess. Is not a queen the same way she had been addressed in her final years. Catherine, Dowager Princess of Wales. The abbey was cold that morning. Candles flickered under the grey stone arches, their flames bending as though unwilling to stay still in the presence of a spirit that had refused to yield in life. The choir sang the Latin Mass in low tones, their voices echoing softly off the walls. Her coffin, carried on black poles, was brought before the altar where the monks of Peterborough waited in solemn ranks. No royal standard draped it. No golden canopy shielded it. Only a plain cloth of black and silver, trimmed with modest embroidery, lay across the lid. And yet for all the silence, for all the attempts to make her small, there was a strange beauty to that service. Those who stood close enough swore they could feel a peace settle over the space, as if the air itself remembered her grace, her dignity, her unshaken composure, even as the world stripped her bare. Her ladies wept quietly, clutching rosaries, whispering prayers for her soul. Her confessor, John Forrest, spoke with trembling voice about faith, duty, and forgiveness. But the sermon that followed was not one of mercy. It was one of politics. The preacher, sent by Henry's court, declared that Catherine had been a good and obedient servant, that she had lived honorably as a princess, and had died without anger toward the king. He said these words as though she had been a subordinate, not an equal. He never once called her queen. The title was omitted with cold precision. Every syllable of Princess Dowager repeated as a small victory for the man who had cast her aside, and those who loved her, those who had walked with her through the slow decay of her life, stood in silence, forced to listen as the memory of her reign was rewritten before their eyes. When the sermon ended, the organ played softly, and her coffin was lowered into the earth. No bells rang from London to mark the moment. No official mourning was declared. Henry did not attend. He stayed in Greenwich, feasting in his new court, already planning the birth of a son with Anne Boleyn. It is said that when news of Catherine's death reached him, he showed no sorrow, only relief. Some chroniclers even claimed that he dressed in yellow, that the court celebrated. Others said he wore black for a few days to quiet the whispers. The truth lies somewhere between those colors, in that murky shade where guilt hides behind ceremony. But Catherine's funeral was not without witnesses of heart. In the crowd that gathered outside the abbey walls, there were villagers, travelers, and even distant nobles who had come to pay their last respects to the woman they still called the true queen. Some carried candles, others carried flowers. They were not allowed inside, but they stood in the cold and sang hymns of their own. And when the earth finally covered her coffin, when the last prayer was spoken, and the candles began to fade, someone, no one knows, who placed a small, hand-painted banner above the grave. It read, simply, Katherine the Queen. That defiance did not last long. The inscription was removed. The crown carved above her tomb was chipped away. The stone that marked her burial bore only her name, and the false title that history had forced upon her. And there, beneath the flagstones of Peterborough Abbey, she lay not beside her husband in Westminster, as she had once expected. But alone. A foreign queen in a foreign grave. Years would pass before anyone spoke her name aloud in reverence again. Her daughter, Mary, would one day ascend the throne and order that her mother be honored properly. But time and politics and the wear of history would make that impossible. Catherine's grave remained simple, unadorned, and largely forgotten until centuries later. When new pilgrims began to arrive, they came not out of obligation, but out of recognition that she, more than anyone, had embodied loyalty without reward, faith without compromise, love without return. They still visit now. The flowers never stop. Every year, on the anniversary of her death, they gather beneath the same vaulted ceiling, their voices carrying prayers she would have understood, words in the language she never abandoned, and on the stone that once denied her title, they have placed a new inscription, one that no king can erase: Katherine the Queen, restored to honor in the hearts of her people, for in the end, it was not the king who decided her worth, nor the court that erased her name, nor the priests who rewrote her prayers. It was the silence she left behind, that gentle, unbroken silence of a woman who never surrendered her grace, even as they stripped her crown away. And so she remains, beneath the earth and beneath the lies. Not a dowager princess, not a discarded wife, but a queen in the truest sense of the word, one who ruled not with power, but with endurance in that small cathedral, in the stillness of her chosen grave. Catherine of Aragon finally has what the living denied her: peace, not the kind granted by kings, but the kind earned by those who never stopped believing they were more than the world chose to remember. The church was cold, and the air hung thick with incense. But not even the scent of sacred smoke could hide the truth of the morning. Catherine of Aragon had died, and though her body lay beneath the vaulted ceiling of Peterborough Abbey, dressed in black, sealed in lead, the words spoken over her coffin did not belong to a queen. They belonged to a fiction, a carefully crafted lie spoken with clerical authority and royal pressure, intended to bury not just the body, but the very identity of the woman who had once worn England's crown with unwavering dignity. It was a funeral stripped of grandeur. The stained glass windows did not shine with royal insignias. The altar did not bear the golden arms of the Tudors. There were no heralds calling her title, no trumpet calls to heaven. And when the preacher stepped forward, carrying the weight of a king's commandment in the fold of his robes, his voice did not tremble, not because he did not feel shame, but because he had long since learned how to speak obedience in the language of God. She was praised as devout, obedient, noble, a mortal princess, a faithful wife. But not once did he call her queen. He used the name Henry had forced into royal usage like a blade drawn slow dowager princess of Wales, as if she had never been crowned, as if the years spent beside the king had been merely the extension of a widow's courtesy, as if the people had not once cheered her through the streets of London, as if the kingdom had not once called her their queen, their rock, their Katherine the Good. The sermon was short, hollow, delivered not with love, but with political precision. It echoed through the abbey like a verdict, a public erasure, masquerading as honor. Those who knew her best stood silent, fists clenched behind sleeves, rosaries tightening around trembling fingers. No one interrupted. No one could. The king had spoken, and in Tudor England, the king's voice was law, even when it echoed from the mouth of a priest, and so the lie was sealed. But the lie did not stop at the pulpit. It followed her down into the earth. When her coffin was lowered, It was placed beneath a simple stone, unadorned, uncelebrated, absent of any symbol of monarchy. There was no crown carved into its face, no Latin epitaph tracing her lineage, no mention of her marriage to Henry VIII, no sign that this woman, now reduced to bone and silence, and had once ruled over England's court and conscience. The inscription read only, "Here lieth Catherine, Dowager, Princess of Wales." 14 words, not one of them true. For Catherine had not died as a widow of Arthur. She had died as the first wife of Henry, his longest marriage, his most loyal companion, the mother of his only surviving child. She had been queen for more than 20 years. Crowned by God and acknowledged by the people, she had ruled in his absence, advised in times of war, nursed the wounded in rebellion, and held the country's heart in her quiet, unwavering hands. She had signed documents as Katherine the Queen. She had lived as one. She had died as one. And yet the stone said otherwise. Stones, after all, cannot tell the truth unless truth is carved into them. Time passed. The abbey, once vibrant, began to fade into obscurity. Peterborough did not become a site of royal pilgrimage. No one raised a mausoleum. The tomb remained bare, a floor till among many, stepped on by generations who no longer read the words or knew the story. The lie lay heavy in the silence, and for centuries, Catherine lay beneath that stone, not in peace, but in quiet protest. But time, though it buries, also remembers. It began with whispers, historians digging into records, visitors reading between the lines, women, especially women, feeling something when they stood over that floor tile and imagined what it must have felt like to be dismissed, renamed, and buried beneath an identity you never chose. Flowers began to appear, small at first, then messages, then banners, pilgrimages, and slowly, something shifted. People remembered, not because the stone had changed, but because the silence around it had. They told her story, not the official one, but the true one. They spoke her name with reverence. They placed crowns made of paper and gold leaf on her grave. They wept for a woman who had died, believing, against all odds, that her dignity was not something a man could take from her with a decree. In the late 20th century, the cathedral, moved by this public devotion, added a new inscription. Simple, respectful, truthful. It did not erase the lie. It laid the truth beside it. A new plaque, resting above the old one. Read, Catherine of Aragon, Queen of England. Buried here. January 1536. It was not grand. It did not rewrite history, but it acknowledged what had been stolen. Because history, too, has bones, and when we dig into the past, we are not always looking for relics. Sometimes, we are looking for the names that were taken, the truths that were silenced, the voices that were not allowed to finish their final prayers. Catherine's stone had once denied her, but the people refused to. And in the end, it was the people who won. Not with swords, but with flowers. Not with proclamations, but with memory. And there is power in that. Because in a world where kings can strip titles, erase faces from portraits, and silence the names of the women they could not control, remembrance becomes resistance. And beneath the floor of Peterborough Abbey lies a queen, who was once buried beneath a lie but who now, through the quiet defiance of those who would not forget her, rests beneath the truth. 241 years after her death, someone decided that her silence was no longer enough. The year was 1777. England was changing. The world beyond its shores was burning with revolution. In the American colonies, rebellion surged like fire in dry fields. In France, whispers of something far more violent stirred. But in the quiet cathedral of Peterborough, where Catherine of Aragon had slept undisturbed for nearly 2.5 centuries, another kind of unrest unfolded, not loud, not bloody, but just as violating. This unrest did not come from soldiers or kings. It came from a man with a drill, a curiosity sharper than reverence, and a complete lack of fear for the dead. They say he was a local official. Others say he was merely an inquisitive mind with no official sanction at all. His name has faded, perhaps mercifully, but his act has not. One morning, with no ceremony, no prayer, no consent from church or crown, he approached the grave of Catherine of Aragon and began to bore a hole through the lead-lined coffin that had held her body since January of 1536. He was not motivated by hatred. That would almost be easier to forgive. No. He was driven by something colder: detachment, curiosity dressed as scientific inquiry, the arrogant conviction that the secrets of the past belonged to the hands of the present. So he drilled, through centuries of metal, through layers of stillness, through the final wall between a queen's body and the world that had already taken everything from her in life. And the coffin, which had once been sealed tight with reverence and care, opened, not all the way, not dramatically, but just enough to let air in, just enough to allow fingers to reach inside, just enough to disturb what had once been preserved. He removed a piece of the cloth. It was only a scrap, he said, a small square of black fabric that had wrapped her body, a remnant, a curiosity to be displayed. But that cloth had been untouched for over 200 years. It had been sealed with oils and prayers, with sacred hands who had dressed her for burial not as a curiosity, but as a woman of grace. When it was removed, when air rushed in, the body inside began to change. Embalming slows time, but it does not stop it. The moment that ancient cloth was disturbed, the balance broke. Moisture, once trapped and still, escaped. The air, once banished, rushed in like a thief. Her skin, once preserved, began to dry and collapse. The structure of her face, the same face that had once smiled at Henry, once kissed Mary's forehead, began to cave. The bones shifted. The decay began again. And for what the man did not write a great scientific treatise. He did not publish findings that changed the world. He did not even restore her name. He simply took something, then walked away. No monument was built to mark the moment. No plaque to apologize. The act passed into the air like breath in winter, visible only for a moment, then gone. But for Catherine, it was not gone. It was another theft, another stripping of dignity, another chapter in a story she had never asked to be part of. Some say the cloth disintegrated shortly after it was exposed to the air, that it crumbled into ash in the man's hands. Others say it was sold, traded, lost in a private collection. No one knows for certain. What is known is that the wound left behind the hole drilled through the coffin of a queen remained. It was patched, but never properly sealed. A scar on the tomb, a mark of violation. For more than 2 centuries, Catherine had remained silent. She had not risen. She had not haunted. But when her grave was pierced, the silence changed. Something sacred had been broken. And though no curses followed, no lightning fell from the sky, those who knew her story began to speak. Visitors who had once passed her tomb without a glance began to linger. They asked questions. They placed flowers. They stared at the stone with something like guilt. Because this was not simply a coffin. This was a woman. This was the daughter of Isabella and Ferdinand. Born in a palace, scented with jasmine, and blessed with the ambitions of empires. This was the girl who crossed an ocean of expectations to marry a prince, only to bury him and start again. This was the queen who stood beside Henry VIII longer than any other, who held the throne through miscarriages and heartbreak, through betrayals and battles, through silence and scandal. This was the mother of a future queen, the woman whose letters dripped with dignity, even when written by hands curled with age and pain. And this was her final resting place. Or it had been. Now, it was a curiosity, a relic, a thing to be touched, studied, unsealed. But the thing about queens, true queens, is that even when disturbed, even when desecrated, their presence lingers. The echo of their strength does not vanish with air or time. It sits beneath the stone like a heartbeat too slow to hear. And Catherine of Aragon, even in death, refused to be silenced. In the years after the desecration, the story began to spread. Historians whispered it with unease. Clergy frowned and shook their heads. Tourists began to speak of the coffin, not as a relic, but as a warning. Children asked why anyone would drill into the body of a queen. No one had an answer. Because there was no answer that could justify it. Only one that could remember it. Today, the whole remains. It has been covered, hidden beneath repairs. But it is there in the coffin. In the story. In the collective conscience of a nation that once crowned her. Then stripped hair. Then buried hair. Then pierced her. A wound, not of flesh, but of memory. A reminder that even death is not always the end for women like Catherine. For queens whose crowns were taken, whose names were erased, whose bodies were disturbed. Remembrance becomes the only form of justice left. And so the people remember. They come with candles, with flowers, with handwritten prayers in Spanish and English and Latin. They kneel beside her stone. They whisper her name, not the one on the original marker, not the one Henry forced into law, but the one history could not quite kill Katherine the Queen. Not even a drill could silence that. There is a particular cruelty in stillness, the kind that belongs to things that were once whole, once sacred, once untouched for centuries, only to collapse not from violence, but from the weightless breath of time, from the moment a seal is broken, and the air that has waited so long outside is finally allowed to come in. That is what happened to the fabric, the soft, solemn cloth that had wrapped Catherine of Aragon like a second skin in death, chosen by hands that had loved her, dressed in silence by women who had whispered prayers into the folds and sealed it against her skin not just to protect her body, but to preserve her dignity. That cloth had lasted longer than kingdoms. It had survived the execution of Anne Boleyn, the crowning of Elizabeth, the burning reign of Mary, the madness of kings, the fall of empires. It had rested against her bones while revolutions were born and extinguished, while cathedrals crumbled and were rebuilt, while generation after generation forgot her name and then remembered. It had lasted more than 200 years without a wrinkle, sealed in darkness, safe from moths, moisture, and meddling, until the day someone opened her. The moment the lead seal was pierced, the cloth began to change. The air did not scream. It whispered, and that whisper was enough. The moisture within the linen began to escape. The weave, once taut, softened. Then it withered. Then it turned to dust. Some say it happened instantly, that the fragment lifted by the man's hands disintegrated before he could even set it aside. Others say it took days, that it faded in stages, like an autumn leaf crumbling between fingers. But one thing all accounts agree on, once touched by the modern world: it could not last. What had been whole became ruin. What had been preserved became exposed. What had once been folded gently over a queen's face turned to a powder that even the wind would not carry. And yet, it was never just about the fabric. It was about what it meant. That cloth was the last privacy she had, the final veil between her and the world, the last act of care in a life where care had too often been denied. She had not died a wife, not died a queen in title, but someone, perhaps a servant, perhaps a nun, had wrapped her in that cloth with the reverence England had failed to give her. It was a second crowning, not of gold, but of grace. And when it turned to dust, it was not just decay. It was desecration. A reminder that not even the quiet dead are safe from the touch of careless hands. But the damage went further still. The air that entered her coffin did not stop with the cloth. It crept into every hollow. It found the hands that had once braided her daughter's hair. It found the lips that had kissed the altar. It found the bones of her spine, once so straight, even in exile. And it began its work. Slow, patient, irreversible. The face, once preserved in shadow, began to collapse inward. The skin, once leathery and taut from embalming, began to flake. The shape of her nose, the contour of her cheek, the arch of her brow, features that had been painted in portraits, whispered of in poems, and remembered by women who saw her not as a royal but as an anchor of strength, began to fade. The body that had once endured miscarriage after miscarriage, that had carried a future queen, that had knelt in endless hours of prayer, that had aged in exile, was now changing again. This time with no one left to hold it, and no one came to stop it. There were no outcries, no official letters of apology, no royal statement. The act, the whole, the theft, the unsealing was written down in a few lines, hidden in local records, treated as a curiosity, a footnote in the growing catalogue of scientific inquiry that defined the late 18th century. The memory of Katherine the Queen was reduced once again, not by hatred, not by politics, but by something far colder: indifference. And perhaps that is the most dangerous thing of all, because while fire destroys, and swords silence, it is indifference that erodes. It is indifference that allows queens to be buried without their titles. It is indifference that allows their graves to be stepped over, opened, written about without reverence. It is indifference that lets their stories be told by those who never loved them, and lets their cloth turn to dust without so much as a candle lit in regret. But Catherine was not made of cloth. She was made of something far more enduring. She had been unloved by her husband, but not by history. She had been denied her crown, but not her grace. She had been buried beneath a lie, but not forgotten. And though her body crumbled, though her wrappings dissolved, though the shape of her no longer remains beneath the stone, what she stood for, what she endured, could not be drilled through, or touched, or taken, because strength like hers is not found in silk or skin or bone. It is found in memory, and memory, once awakened, does not crumble. It builds, layer by layer, story by story, visit by visit, until one day, the very place that once denied her, the abbey that had buried her beneath the wrong name, the country that had allowed her grave to be pierced, began to honor her again. They could not restore her cloth. They could not unseal her coffin. They could not undo the damage. But they could kneel. They could speak her name. They could place flowers on a grave that had once been bare. And in doing so, they gave her back the one thing: no cloth, no crown, no seal could ever replace dignity, not granted by kings, but given by those who remembered. There is no crown above her name, no marble effigy, no golden halo, no stone canopy carved with angels lifting her soul skyward, no queenly Latin titles etched in deep Gothic script, no lion beneath her feet, no scepter across her breast, no husband buried beside her to hold her hand in stone, just a slab of gray, plain and smooth, set into the flagstones of Peterborough Cathedral, so modest it might be mistaken for a floor tile, and walked over by strangers who do not know that beneath their shoes lies the woman who was once the First Lady of England and should have died its queen. They buried her without honor. But the grave still speaks. It does not shout. It waits, quietly. A flat voice in a cathedral built to echo kings and psalms. And though the stone bears the wrong title Catherine, Dowager Princess of Wales, and though it was chosen not out of reverence but political spite, it has endured, not because it told the truth, but because those who loved her refused to let it be the final word. The grave refused to be grand, because the court refused her grandeur. When Catherine of Aragon died in the bitter cold of January 1536, Henry was already feasting. Anne Boleyn was already heavy with the child who would become Elizabeth. The court had no time for mourning. Her funeral was arranged in haste. Her coffin was sent north, not to Westminster, but to a quiet, respectable cathedral far from the king's eye. No mourning clothes were worn at court. No days of solemn silence were declared. Her daughter Mary was barred from attending even in death. She was kept apart from the family she had once built with devotion, from the people she had served without falter. At Peterborough, they gave her a simple service, dressed it in formality, cloaked it in duty, but underneath, it was nothing more than a burial of convenience. The title engraved on her grave was not the one she had lived and died by. It was the one Henry had forced into law, the one he had printed in decrees, the one he hoped history would accept, and for a time, it did. For centuries, visitors passed her grave without pause. There were no signs, no flowers, no stories. She was a name on a stone, not a soul in a kingdom. And yet, time has a way of remembering what kings forget. It began slowly, a visitor here, a scholar there, people who knew that this woman had once ruled beside the most famous king in English history, people who remembered the girl who crossed an ocean for a marriage of state, who was queen for 20 years, who stood by her vows when her husband would not, who had been cast aside not for treason, but for aging, people who began to kneel. They brought lilies, they brought prayers, they brought names, and with them, the restoration of hers. They began to whisper what the stone would not say, Katherine the Queen. And little by little, memory bloomed again. The grave was cleaned, the edges cleared. Condoli, not by order of the crown, but by the love of the people, because memory, once awakened, does not fade back into silence. It grows, like ivy across old stone, slowly, persistently, reclaiming what once was. Eventually, the cathedral could not ignore it. They added a small plaque, not to replace the stone, but to speak alongside it. This new inscription did what the old one had not. It told the truth. It acknowledged her as Queen of England, not Dowager, not princess, not forgotten. It did not come from the hand of a king, but from the hand of time, the quiet justice that arrives too late to be called mercy, but just in time to be called right. And still, the grave remained flat. It did not rise up in grandeur. It did not demand attention. It stayed there, silent, beneath the feet of pilgrims, worshippers, tourists, and those who came not for spectacle, but for something smaller, reverence. Because perhaps this was how Catherine would have wanted it. No golden canopy could have undone the exile. No statue could return the daughter stolen from her arms. No parade of royal trumpets could restore the years spent in silence, waiting to be remembered. But this humble slab, now worn smooth by the feet of those who care, now adorned each year with flowers, with love, with whispered prayers in Spanish and English. This was not grand, but it was sacred, because it was hers, and because, despite everything, it endured. Catherine of Aragon was never given a state funeral. She was never reburied in Westminster Abbey, beside the man who had once sworn eternal love, only to turn his eyes to another. Her bones were never crowned in marble. Her grave was never raised high above the rest. But her story, the story of a woman who held her dignity, even as they stripped away her titles, who signed her name Katherine the Queen until her final breath, who lived with quiet conviction in the face of royal betrayal, has become one of the most enduring in English memory. And perhaps that, in the end, is the grandest legacy of all. Not a tomb that rises above the others, but a grave that makes people lower their heads. Not a title etched in gold, but a name spoken with warmth. Not a crown carved in stone, but the soft imprint of reverence pressed into the hearts of those who still remember. There are women history forgets, and there are women history tries to forget, but Catherine of Aragon was neither. She was the kind of woman who lingers, not loudly, not violently, but patiently. She lingers in the spaces they tried to erase, in the silence between royal decrees that refuse to call her queen, in the footsteps that cross her grave without realizing they are walking on a story that refused to be silenced, in the letters she signed until her dying breath, Katherine the Queen, in the prayers whispered over her name by strangers who never met her, but who somehow understood her. She does not haunt. She remains, like the steady flame of a vigil held too long to be accidental, like the voice in the back of your mind reminding you that being erased is not the same as being forgotten. Henry tried to erase her, not because she was weak, but because she would not bend. She would not declare her marriage invalid. She would not surrender her crown. She would not call Anne queen. She would not let go of the belief that a promise made before God was not something that could be reversed by politics or passion. And in not bending, she became immovable, not in court, but in memory. Catherine never raised an army. She never led a rebellion. She never conspired to return to court or plotted to poison her rivals. All she ever did was stay true to her vows, stay loyal to her faith, stay present in the heart of a daughter she wasn't allowed to see, stay rooted in a quiet strength that did not scream for attention, but stood firm in the face of being slowly, deliberately, written out of history. That is the kind of power they never expect. That quiet, bone-deep resilience, that refusal to vanish, and even when they buried her under the wrong title, even when they denied her a royal tomb, even when they drilled into her coffin and stole the last layer of dignity left to her still, she did not vanish, because there are some truths too solid for time to crack. Catherine loved a man who did not love her back. She carried children who did not live. She wore a crown that was taken from her hand. She died in a borrowed castle, far from the court, she once ruled, wrapped not in glory, but in silence. And still she is remembered, not because she demanded it, but because something in her story speaks to the part of us that knows what it means to hold on when everything tells us to let go, to keep believing in the worth of our word, even when no one else does, to lose everything, and still rise in memory, not as a footnote, but as a foundation. So tonight, if you are lying awake in a silence too loud, if you are feeling erased, replaced, or forgotten, remember here, the girl who crossed the sea for a kingdom that never truly became hers, the wife who waited in cold castles for a letter that never came, the queen who signed her name in defiance, even as they called her something else, the mother who died without her child beside her, but with her dignity unbroken, the woman who never disappeared. Not really. She rests beneath stone now, simple and flat, no throne above, no husband beside, no court in waiting, and yet she is not alone, because every flower placed on that grave is a crown. Every whispered Katherine, the Queen, is a coronation. Every story told in her name is a throne rebuilt, not of gold, but of memory. And that is how the wife who was supposed to vanish became the queen who never left.